Courtroom number 4 fell into a suffocating silence. All eyes were fixed on the mysterious man standing in the center. When the Westbridge Corporation's attorney demanded identification, Marcus Bennett simply smiled and pulled out his FBI badge. The entire room was shaken. But this was only the beginning of a life-or-death showdown between justice and the hidden forces of financial power. The cold fluorescent lights beamed down onto the polished wooden floor of courtroom number 4, reflecting off the dark suits seated neatly in the long rows of benches. The room was packed, with some attendees standing along the walls, whispering in hushed voices. The air was heavy, as if everything was just waiting for a single spark to ignite. Judge Harold Whitmore sat high on the bench, tapping his fingers lightly against the file in front of him. The man had held this position for nearly 30 years, presiding over hundreds of cases with all manner of charges. But today, something unsettled him. It wasn't the lawsuit. It was the man in the gray suit, sitting silently in the middle row. Marcus Bennett. Who the hell was this guy? Whitmore had noticed Marcus the moment he stepped into the courtroom. A black man, well-dressed, yet not quite fitting the profile of an attorney. He wasn't the defendant, nor the plaintiff, nor part of the prosecution. So what was he doing here? Whitmore's gaze darkened. Outsiders had no place in his courtroom. A faint rustling broke the silence. Paul Singleton, the defense attorney, had risen to his feet. His sharp eyes locked onto Marcus. Singleton was a seasoned corporate lawyer, a graying middle-aged man renowned for twisting the law in favor of his clients. He spoke, each word deliberate, aimed directly at Whitmore. Your Honor, we have identified an unknown individual in the courtroom. This person has been taking notes in a highly suspicious manner. We request that his identity be verified. A moment of silence. Then, murmurs rippled through the crowd like a wave. A few reporters turned their heads toward Marcus, while others discreetly reached for their phones. Whitmore had his chance to act. He turned, fixing Marcus with a piercing stare. The man in the gray suit. His voice was firm, commanding. Stand up and state your identity. Marcus lifted his gaze, meeting Whitmore's scrutinizing eyes. He wasn't surprised. He was used to this. The wary stares, the sharp words. The doors slammed shut in his face, just because of the color of his skin. But today, he wasn't backing down. Marcus slowly stood, setting his notebook down on the wooden bench. His voice was low but steady. I'm Marcus Bennett, legal consultant for the defense team. Whitmore narrowed his eyes. Legal consultant? He leaned back slightly, his tone filled with doubt. Who authorized you to be here? Before Marcus could answer, another voice cut in. Your Honor. Linda Martinez had risen to her feet. She was the plaintiff's attorney, a sharp-witted Latino lawyer known for taking on labor rights cases. She met Whitmore's gaze without a hint of hesitation. Mr. Bennett was invited by our defense team. He has the right. Whitmore raised a hand, cutting her off. I don't care. A tense silence stretched across the room. Whitmore placed both hands on the bench, his voice dropping to a cold, steely tone. I do not allow unidentified individuals in my courtroom. A statement heavy with implication. Linda pressed her lips together. Marcus remained expressionless, but his fingers tightened slightly against the bench. Whitmore wasn't done. Court officers. He turned to the bailiff, standing near the door. Escort him out. The murmurs in the room turned into chaos. A court officer, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, strode forward, placing a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus felt his body heat rise. The anger, the injustice, the familiarity of this situation. His entire life had been shaped by prejudice. But this time, he wasn't stepping aside. Slowly, he reached into his coat, pulled out a small object, and raised it high for all to see. A badge. Not a legal consultant's badge. An FBI badge. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Shock. Sharp intakes of breath. A few reporters' mouths fell open. Whitmore's face paled. What the hell is this? Marcus held his ground, his voice strong and unwavering. I'm a special agent with the FBI. I am here under direct orders from my superiors. No one spoke. Paul Singleton's lips pressed into a thin line. Linda Martinez stared at Marcus in disbelief. Whitmore took a deep breath. He glanced at the bailiff, who had frozen in place, suddenly realizing that the man he had just laid hands on was a federal agent. In mere seconds, Whitmore grasped the gravity of the situation. His fingers clenched around the gavel, and he brought it down hard. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Marcus slowly lowered his badge. He exhaled, steady and controlled. The game of power had just begun. The hallway outside courtroom number 4 buzzed with hushed conversations. A few reporters scribbled notes frantically, while others had already raised their phones to capture the moment. They didn't want to miss this rare spectacle. A legal consultant ordered out of court, only to reveal himself as an FBI agent. Marcus Bennett stepped out of the courtroom with unshaken composure. His leather shoes tapped rhythmically against the marble floor. Around him, scattered court staff lingered, their gazes filled with suspicion. He was used to those looks: doubt, fear, and a hint of discomfort. Behind him, Linda Martinez strode forward as the courtroom door swung shut. "Stop." Marcus didn't turn, but his steps slowed. "You're FBI?" Linda's voice was low, edged with disbelief, as if she still couldn't process what she had just witnessed. Marcus inhaled deeply. The question was inevitable. He turned slowly. Linda's eyes burned with an unreadable fire, anger, confusion, and perhaps a flicker of betrayal. "We can't talk here." Marcus's voice was quiet as his gaze flicked toward the reporters leaning in to eavesdrop. Linda clenched her jaw but nodded. Marcus led her to a small conference room, a space designated for lawyers to consult privately with their clients. The room was empty, furnished with a long wooden table and 4 black leather chairs. He pushed the door open, motioning for Linda to enter first. She walked in briskly, then shut the door with enough force to make the framed picture on the wall tremble. "Talk." Linda folded her arms across her chest, her gaze sharp. "For God's sake, you're FBI? Why the hell are you involved in this case?" Marcus exhaled, then pulled out a chair and sat down. "Because this case isn't just about discrimination." Linda frowned, but remained silent. Marcus lowered his voice, each word deliberate. "Westbridge Alliance is involved in money laundering. And not just that, they've been selling confidential financial data to a foreign organization." The air in the room shifted. Linda took a few seconds to process what she had just heard. Money laundering? Selling financial data? This was not what she had expected when she took on this case. "Then why hasn't the FBI taken them down already?" she asked, skepticism lacing her tone. Marcus clenched his jaw, his expression darkening. "Because we need irrefutable evidence." He met her eyes. "If we move too soon, Westbridge will wipe everything clean." Linda was beginning to understand. Westbridge was one of the largest financial conglomerates in the country. If they were indeed running a laundering operation, they would have the resources to bury it. Marcus continued, "This lawsuit is a critical link in the chain. If the plaintiffs win, Westbridge will be forced to disclose internal documents. Those records could be the key to tracing the illegal funds." Linda sank into a chair, resting her hands on the table. "You're telling me this lawsuit is part of an FBI operation?" "Exactly." She took a deep breath, leaning back, staring up at the ceiling. For weeks, she had felt like something was off. Westbridge had poured enormous resources into their defense. They had used every trick in the book to delay proceedings, even hiring a powerhouse legal team to pressure the plaintiffs into dropping the case. Now everything made sense. Linda looked back at Marcus. "And I assume you need this case to continue." Marcus nodded. "I need your help to ensure it doesn't get settled or dismissed." Linda pressed her lips together, her gaze darkening. "What about Whitmore?" Marcus hesitated for a beat before answering. "I don't have concrete proof, but he's attended multiple events sponsored by Westbridge." Linda blinked. "Are you saying he might be compromised?" Marcus's hand curled into a loose fist. "I can't say for certain, but if he actively obstructs this case, then we have a serious problem." Linda's fingers tightened on the table as she nodded slowly. "Then we keep an eye on him." Marcus studied her carefully. He knew Linda was a skilled lawyer, but more importantly, she had integrity. She wouldn't turn her back on justice. Marcus rose to his feet, buttoning his suit jacket. Thank you, Martinez. Linda stood as well, exhaling sharply. I don't know if I should be thanking you. She held his gaze. But if you're right, this case is far more dangerous than I thought. Marcus gave her a small nod. Which is exactly why I need you to help me keep it alive. Linda was silent for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and extended her hand. Marcus clasped it firmly. Then let's get to the bottom of this. Linda's voice was steady. Marcus nodded. He had a feeling the power struggle had only just begun. The next day, the trial resumed. Courtroom number 4 was no longer the quiet place it had been the day before. The air was heavier, more tense than ever. Marcus entered the courtroom, his gaze immediately landing on the high bench. Judge Whitmore. The man looked more unsettled than usual. His fingers tapped incessantly against the desk, his once steely gaze now flickering with uncertainty. Every now and then, he rubbed his temple, as if trying to suppress something deeply unpleasant. He was nervous. Marcus took his seat. Beside him, Linda Martinez followed his gaze toward Whitmore. He looks anxious, she murmured. Marcus gave a slight nod. He knows the FBI is watching. Linda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Are you sure he's involved? Marcus didn't answer right away. Concrete evidence? Not yet, but his instincts told him something was off. The trial began. Danielle Roberts, the lead plaintiff, stepped onto the witness stand. She was a black woman in her early 30s, a former senior specialist at Westbridge. She sat upright, her eyes burning with determination. Linda approached. Ms. Roberts, can you describe what happened to you at Westbridge? Danielle took a deep breath before speaking. I worked there for nearly 8 years. I always believed I had the same opportunities as everyone else. But then I realized some doors were never meant to open for people like me. The courtroom fell silent. I was excluded from major projects. My performance reviews were unfairly downgraded. Employees with less experience than me were promoted ahead of me. She paused, her hands clasped together. And then I found the internal emails. Linda nodded, pressing forward. Can you describe the contents of those emails? In them, senior executives discussed maintaining uniformity in leadership roles. They talked about needing a professional image to attract investors. And they didn't want anyone who didn't fit that image. A chilling stillness settled over the room. Marcus watched Whitmore, and he saw him swallow hard. Shit, he's really nervous. Suddenly, Whitmore raised his hand. Hold on. Linda turned, frowning. Is there a problem, Your Honor? Whitmore planted both hands on the bench, his voice carrying a slight strain. The documents Ms. Roberts is referring to lack sufficient authenticity. Marcus narrowed his eyes. There it is. I will not allow this evidence, Whitmore said, gripping his gavel tighter than usual. He struck it down with more force than necessary. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Linda refused to back down. Your Honor, these documents were retrieved from Westbridge's own email system. We can verify. I've made my ruling. Whitmore cut her off, his voice laced with urgency. This evidence is inadmissible. Marcus tightened his grip around his pen. Whitmore was protecting Westbridge. Lowering his gaze, Marcus quickly scribbled a note in his notebook. He knows something, and he's trying to bury it. Beneath the desk, his phone vibrated. A coded message. Meet at the old library. 9 p.m. Marcus narrowed his eyes. A source had just surfaced. 9 p.m. A cold wind swept through the empty streets. The dim glow of streetlights cast pale halos onto the cracked pavement. The old library lay hidden deep within a rarely traveled alley, a place without surveillance cameras, nearly abandoned at night. Marcus walked slowly, his sharp gaze scanning for anything unusual. He never attended a meeting in the dark without being prepared. From the shadows between 2 aging bookshelves, a man stepped forward. He wore a gray hoodie pulled low over his face, but Marcus could still see the deep-set eyes filled with tension beneath the fabric. Did you come alone? The man rasped. Marcus gave a single nod. I always do. The man glanced over his shoulder, as if afraid someone had followed him. Then, he shoved a thick envelope into Marcus's hands. These are internal financial reports from Westbridge, he said, his voice trembling slightly. "They don't match the numbers they show the government or shareholders." Marcus opened the envelope and skimmed through the pages. A perfect money laundering scheme. On the surface, every figure in Westbridge's official reports to the SEC matched. But when cross-referenced with these documents, a hidden stream of tens of millions of dollars emerged, vanished into off-the-record accounts. Marcus lifted his eyes, razor-sharp. "Who gave this to you?" The man swallowed hard. "An accountant inside Westbridge. He's been tracking this for a while, but he couldn't report it. He was afraid they'd make him disappear." Marcus clenched his jaw, his pulse quickening. This confirmed everything. Westbridge wasn't just engaging in workplace discrimination. They were laundering money through underground banking networks and selling financial data to a foreign entity. "Where are your people?" The man whispered anxiously. "You said the FBI would protect me." Marcus held his gaze steady. His voice was firm. "We will. But tell me, what about the other source? The one who pulled these records?" The man hesitated for a long second. Then, he spoke the words that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "He's gone?" The air in the library felt like it had frozen. Marcus didn't blink. "Gone?" The man nodded, lowering his voice further. "He sent these files to me, then told me he felt like someone was following him. Last night, I tried calling him, but his phone was completely disconnected. I went to his apartment. Empty. Everything was wiped out, like he never existed." A cold wave crept up Marcus's spine. Disappearances like this weren't coincidences. "Has anyone reported it to the police?" "No one." The man shook his head. He had no family in this city. If he's missing, no one will notice. This wasn't an accident. Someone knew about the investigation, and they were erasing loose ends. Marcus inhaled deeply, tucking the documents inside his coat. "You need to disappear for a while." The man flinched. "What do you mean?" "If they know you have these files, you're next." The man took a step back, panic flickering across his face. "No, I can't just leave." Marcus raised a steady hand, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Listen to me. Do you have a safe place to go?" The man hesitated, his lips pressed tight. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "A friend. I can stay with him for a few days." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded back. "Then leave the city tonight. If you need to contact me, use a secure number. No one can know we met." The man took a shaky breath before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the alley. Marcus stood still for a few seconds, letting the cold wind brush against the back of his neck. Someone was watching him. He could feel it. Westbridge knew, and they had just started fighting back. 12 a.m., Danielle Roberts' apartment. Marcus and Linda stood in the shadows across the street from a small apartment complex. The lights in Danielle's unit were off, but that wasn't what worried Marcus. It was the black SUV parked 2 blocks down. The engine was still running. Marcus glanced at Linda and lowered his voice. "Do you see the SUV?" Linda gave a slight nod, frowning. "They're waiting for someone." Marcus narrowed his eyes, instinct screaming that something was very wrong. If someone was watching Danielle's apartment, she could already be in danger. "We have to get inside," Linda whispered. Marcus didn't argue. He discreetly checked his Glock hidden beneath his coat, then moved up the steps. Linda followed close behind. The front door was unlocked. Not a good sign. Marcus drew his gun, carefully pushing the door open. Darkness. He stepped in first, immediately sensing the unnatural stillness in the air. Linda raised her phone, shining a light on the wall. No one there, but the place had been ransacked. The sofa was shoved aside, papers scattered across the floor. A glass had fallen and shattered near the kitchen. A cold chill crept up Marcus's spine. Someone had been here first. Linda moved toward the bedroom door, gently pushing it open. Empty. No sign of Danielle. Marcus walked to her desk, where a laptop still sat open. But every single file had been wiped clean. His jaw clenched. "They got here before us." Linda moved quickly to the window and looked outside. The SUV was still there. But now, the driver's door was open. Marcus's heart pounded harder. "We need to move. We're being watched." Linda spun around just as Marcus switched off the lights. They pressed into the shadows, eyes fixed on the street. A man stepped out of the SUV. Tall, wearing a long coat and a black cap. Marcus instantly recognized his movements. This wasn't just some hired thug. This was a professional. Linda whispered, "What do we do?" Marcus inhaled deeply, eyes locked on the man. The figure stood still for a moment, as if listening to something in an earpiece. Then he turned back and climbed into the SUV. The vehicle rolled away, disappearing into the night. For a few seconds, neither Marcus nor Linda spoke. Then Marcus turned to her, his voice low. "We just stepped into something much bigger than we thought." Linda met his gaze, her expression darkening. "And we can't stop now." Marcus took a slow breath. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. They were up against an enemy willing to erase anyone in their way. And Marcus knew the real fight had only just begun. 6:30 a.m. Temporary safe house. Marcus Bennett stood by the window, eyes locked on the street below. The first city buses of the morning rolled over rain-slicked asphalt. He hadn't slept all night. Danielle Roberts was missing. Her apartment had been ransacked, her laptop wiped clean. Marcus knew one thing for sure. Westbridge was silencing everyone who knew too much. And that could be next. His phone buzzed. A message from Jared Cole. 7 a.m. Building 214. "Come alone." Marcus frowned. Beside him, Linda noticed his reaction. He finally agreed to meet? Marcus nodded and showed her the screen. Linda clenched her jaw and turned toward the window. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "Then let's go. I don't think we have much time." 6:50 a.m. on the way to the meeting. Inside the black SUV, Marcus drove through the nearly empty streets. The sky was still heavy with the remnants of last night's rain. Next to him, Linda ejected the magazine from her Beretta, checked the rounds, and slammed it back in place, quick and precise. He said to come alone, she reminded him. Marcus nodded, but had no intention of following that instruction. "I don't like walking into traps." Linda smirked dryly, resting the gun on her lap. "For once, we agree on something." 7 a.m., the abandoned building. Building 214 sat deep in a quiet alleyway, untouched by the weak glow of nearby streetlights. Marcus killed the engine, but didn't get out right away. He checked the rearview mirror. No tails. Linda glanced at the building, her tone dropping to a whisper. "If he's on the run, why is he agreeing to meet us?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his Glock 19, checked the chamber, and slid it into his holster. Only one way to find out. 7:05 a.m. inside the building. The door creaked as Marcus pushed it open. The air inside was stale. Dim light flickered from a single overhead bulb, casting jittery shadows against peeling walls. And standing in the center of the room, Jared Cole. He looked rough, thinner than in his FBI file. His beard was unkempt, hair disheveled, dark circles carved beneath his eyes. But most importantly, he looked terrified. Marcus stepped forward, his voice low. "What do you have for us?" Jared's eyes flickered toward the window. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Not much time. They found me." Linda tensed, stepping closer. "Boom." Jared swallowed hard, then pulled out a crumpled stack of documents from inside his coat. He handed it to Marcus, his voice raw. "Hamilton and Company is just a front. Westbridge's money gets funneled through accounts in Eastern Europe, where an international laundering network cleans it." Linda flipped through the pages, scanning the numbers. But then she froze. A name leaped off the page. Malcolm Whitmore. Marcus's heartbeat ticked up. So Whitmore is the one pulling the strings? Jared blinked, then shook his head. "No, he's just a pawn." Marcus and Linda both stiffened. "Then who's really in charge?" Marcus demanded. Jared took a breath, parted his lips to answer. Crash! The window shattered. Linda screamed as a bullet ripped through the air, slamming into the wall behind her. Marcus whipped around, gun drawn. His eyes darted toward the jagged remains of the window. Ambush! Jared's face turned pale as he stammered. "They found me." Marcus clenched his jaw, voice sharp. "Run now!" 7:07 a.m. inside the abandoned building. Glass shattered. Linda screamed, instinctively dropping to the floor, her arms shielding her head. Marcus spun around instantly, yanking Jared down just as another bullet slammed through the window, embedding itself deep into the wall behind them. Ambush. From the outside, Marcus couldn't see the shooter, but judging by the angle, the sniper was likely positioned on a nearby rooftop. Jared was panicking, trembling violently as he yelled, "They found me! They found me!" Marcus clamped a hand over his mouth, his voice cold as ice. "Shut up unless you want to die here." Linda crawled closer, her eyes sharp and alert. "How the hell do we get out of here?" Marcus flicked his gaze toward the window. If they had a sniper, running out the front door was suicide. His eyes scanned the room. Then he saw it, a door leading to the basement. A way out. Marcus turned to Linda, whispering, "Basement exit. Move now." She nodded, keeping her gun close as she darted toward it. Marcus grabbed Jared by the collar and yanked him to his feet. "Let's go." Jared's face was ghostly pale, but he nodded frantically, his hands shaking. Keeping low, Marcus dragged him forward, moving swiftly through the dimly lit room. Crack! Another bullet ripped through the wooden door, grazing Jared's shoulder. He screamed, stumbling to the floor. Linda whipped around, eyes wide. Did he get it? Marcus gritted his teeth, yanking Jared's shirt aside to check. No blood. He exhaled. No, just a graze. Jared was still panting, his whole body trembling. Marcus didn't have time for this. He grabbed Jared's collar, voice harsh. "Listen to me. You are not dying today. But if you don't get up and run, I will leave your ass here to get shot." Jared swallowed hard. The fear in his eyes didn't fade, but it forced him to move. He clenched his fists, nodding rapidly. Marcus pulled him up, and the three of them rushed toward the basement door. Linda reached it first. Crack! Another bullet shattered the door frame, splintering wood everywhere. Marcus didn't hesitate. He shoved Jared inside, Linda following right after, then slammed the door shut behind them. 7:10 a.m., abandoned basement. Darkness. Marcus breathed heavily, eyes scanning the space. This had once been a storage area. Old wooden shelves lined the walls, stacks of dusty boxes tipped over in forgotten corners. Linda exhaled sharply, turning to Marcus. "We can't stay here. They'll come down after us." Marcus agreed. His eyes roamed the room, then locked onto a metal door on the far wall. A second exit. He signaled Linda. "Escape route. Check it." She nodded and moved swiftly toward it. Jared was still shaking, but at least he was silent now. Marcus listened carefully, his gaze locked on the wooden stairs leading back up. They were creaking. Someone was coming down. Marcus tightened his grip on his Glock. "Hurry up, Linda fought with the rusted lock, pulling out a knife to pry it open. Footsteps. Closer. Then, bang! The basement door burst open. A silhouetted figure lunged forward, gun raised. Bang! Marcus fired first. The bullet slammed into the attacker's shoulder. The man howled in pain, staggering backward onto the stairs. Linda wrenched the door open. "Go now!" Marcus grabbed Jared, shoving him through the exit. Linda bolted out next. Marcus followed last, gun still raised. The second his feet hit the alleyway outside, he slammed the metal door shut behind them. Crack! A bullet pierced the door, but they were already gone. 7:15 a.m., back alley behind the building. Cold morning wind whipped through the alley, carrying the stench of rain-soaked trash. Linda was still breathing hard, her grip firm around her gun. Marcus turned to Jared, his voice sharp. "Are you absolutely sure no one knew you were meeting us?" Jared swallowed hard, his body still trembling. "I don't know." Marcus stared at him, unblinking. "Think." Jared squeezed his eyes shut, as if forcing himself to remember. Then his face changed. "Wait, I spoke to Paul Singleton before I contacted you." Linda's eyes snapped wide open. "Paul Singleton? Westbridge's lead attorney?" Jared nodded frantically. "I didn't tell him much. I just said I had something the FBI would want. I didn't think." Marcus clenched his fists. That was it. Westbridge had known about this meeting all along, which meant Paul Singleton was the one who tipped him off. Linda's teeth clenched as she looked at Marcus. "What are you thinking?" Marcus holstered his gun, his expression ice cold. "I think it's time we paid Singleton a visit." 8 a.m. inside Marcus's SUV. The black SUV sped through the damp streets, tires slicing through shallow puddles left by last night's rain. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying everything that had just happened. They had walked into an ambush. Someone knew they were meeting Jared Cole, and now that same someone knew Jared was still alive. There was a leak. Next to him, Linda Martinez leaned against the window, her expression just as grim. She was thinking the same thing. In the back seat, Jared sat stiffly, his body still trembling from the attempted hit. But when he mentioned Paul Singleton's name, Marcus had finally connected the dots. Westbridge had a rat, an inside man, and if Jared was telling the truth, that man was Paul Singleton, Westbridge's lead attorney. Linda inhaled deeply, breaking the silence. What are we going to do about Singleton? Marcus clenched his jaw, eyes still locked on the road. We're going to give him one chance to tell the truth. Linda narrowed her eyes. And if he doesn't? Marcus flicked the turn signal, taking a sharp right onto an empty street. His voice was ice cold. Then I'll make him talk. 8:30 a.m., Paul Singleton's office. The Peterson and Singleton LLP building sat in the heart of the city's financial district. Sleek, polished, prestigious. Hardly the kind of place one would expect to be tied to an international money laundering operation. Marcus parked a block away and turned to Linda. You going first? Linda frowned. Why? Because if he sees me, he won't say a damn thing. Linda bit her lip, then gave a slow nod. And you? Marcus tapped his phone screen a few times, then placed it into recording mode. I'll be listening. Linda understood immediately. If Singleton admitted anything, they would have the evidence needed to flip the case upside down. She took a deep breath, adjusted her blazer, and stepped out of the car. 8:40 a.m. inside Singleton's office. Paul Singleton sat behind his massive oak desk, flipping through a file without much interest. When Linda entered, he looked up and flashed a practiced smile. Linda Martinez, I wasn't expecting you. Linda returned a polite but empty smile, sliding into a chair across from him. I just have a few questions. Singleton folded his hands. About? Linda held his gaze. Jared Cole. His expression changed. Not much, but just enough. A brief flicker in his eyes. A half-second delay before his response. Who? Linda smirked. Don't play dumb, Paul. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Singleton sat up straighter, his demeanor shifting. If this is some kind of fishing expedition, Martinez, then I'd say our conversation is over. Linda leaned forward, hands pressed against his desk. Jared Cole was nearly killed this morning. Someone ambushed him, right when he was on his way to meet me and Special Agent Bennett. Singleton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Linda studied him carefully before continuing. And strangely enough, Jared told me that the last person he spoke to before reaching out to us was you. A muscle in Singleton's neck twitched. Linda caught it. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. So, Paul, care to explain? Singleton was silent for a moment. Then, he exhaled through his nose and smirked. You know, Martinez, you're good at applying pressure. Linda didn't flinch. It's my job. Singleton stared at her for a long moment before sighing. Fine. I admit, Jared reached out to me. Linda didn't blink. And you tipped off Westbridge? Singleton's smirk widened, but his voice was smooth. I did what was necessary to protect my client. Linda's voice darkened. By helping them silence a witness? Singleton shrugged. By ensuring no one stood in their way. Click. The sound of a door unlocking. Singleton's head snapped up. Marcus stepped inside, phone in hand. Singleton's face went pale. Marcus pressed play on the recording. I did what was necessary to protect my client. By ensuring no one stood in their way. The color drained from Singleton's face. Linda smirked. Would you like to try that again? 9 a.m. inside Marcus's SUV. Singleton sat in the back seat, wrists cuffed. He wasn't smiling anymore. Marcus locked eyes with him through the rearview mirror. His voice was devoid of emotion. I have two pieces of news for you. One bad, one very bad. Singleton swallowed. Marcus continued. The bad news? The FBI now has enough evidence to charge you with obstruction of a federal investigation. Singleton's lips pressed into a thin line. And the very bad news? If you don't tell us who's really running Westbridge's operation, you're the only one going to prison. Linda turned in her seat, arms crossed. So, Paul, do you want to make a deal? Or do you want to find out what Westbridge does to people who are no longer useful to them? Singleton closed his eyes and took a slow, shaky breath. He knew he was out of options. Then, he opened his eyes, looked straight at Marcus, and said a name Marcus never expected. 9:15 a.m., FBI headquarters. Paul Singleton sat in the interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent light casting deep shadows across his pale face. His wrists were cuffed to the table, but that wasn't what terrified him. What terrified him was the fact that his life was now over, at least the one he knew. Marcus Bennett leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his cold gaze drilling into Singleton. Across from Singleton, Linda Martinez flipped through a file, her voice steady but sharp. You said Whitmore isn't the one calling the shots. Singleton licked his dry lips, his voice rasping from nerves. No, he's just a pawn. He helps Westbridge cover things up, but the real orders don't come from him. Marcus narrowed his eyes, his voice sharp as a blade. Then who do they come from? Singleton hesitated, his gaze flickering. Saying this name out loud could get him killed, but not saying it meant spending the rest of his life in prison. He swallowed hard, then dropped his head and whispered, Martin Langley. Marcus and Linda exchanged a glance. Martin Langley. The name wasn't new to the FBI. The CEO of Langley and Grant Investments, one of the most powerful financial firms in the country. Untouchable. Clean. A ghost in the world of high finance. But FBI intelligence had flagged him for years, a suspected player in international money laundering operations. Linda exhaled slowly, her voice careful. You're sure? Singleton nodded quickly. Positive. He's the one pulling the strings. Marcus clenched his jaw. If Langley was the true mastermind, then Westbridge was just a front. Whitmore was merely the legal enabler. And that meant this wasn't just a financial crime. This was a full-scale corporate conspiracy. 10 a.m., FBI strategy room. Marcus and Linda stood before an evidence board, covered in photos, financial statements, and connection maps, all leading to Martin Langley. FBI Supervisory Agent Jonathan Harper crossed his arms as he studied the information. We've had our eyes on Langley for years, but we never had enough to take him down. Linda gestured towards Singleton's documents. Well, now we do. Harper flipped through the pages, then turned to Marcus. So what's the next move? Marcus thought for a moment, then spoke decisively. Westbridge is just a pawn. Whitmore is the shield. But Langley, he's the king. He tapped a series of suspicious offshore transactions on the document. If we trace these accounts, we can prove how he's laundering the money. Harper nodded, then turned to Linda. I need you to work with our financial crimes unit. Track every single one of Langley's transactions. Linda nodded. Understood. Harper then faced Marcus. And you? Marcus's expression darkened. I'm going to see Whitmore. 10:45 a.m., Judge Whitmore's office. The door swung open violently as Marcus strode inside without knocking. Judge Malcolm Whitmore looked up, startled, but quickly composed himself. Agent Bennett, I don't recall us having an appointment. Marcus stepped forward and slapped a file onto the judge's desk. Paul Singleton confessed. And I think you want to know, we found out who's really behind this. Whitmore's eyes flickered to the file. When he saw the name Martin Langley, he blinked, but he didn't look surprised. That only made Marcus more certain. Martin Langley, Marcus said slowly. I know you work for him. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus's stare hardened. I'm saying that if you cooperate with the FBI, you might have a chance to avoid a federal indictment. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. And if you don't? Marcus pressed forward, planting both hands on the desk. Then you'll be the only one taking the fall. For the first time, Whitmore's mask cracked. A flicker of fear flashed across his eyes. Marcus could tell he was struggling with the decision. And then, bang, the door slammed open. A man in a black suit entered, his face grim. He strode directly to Whitmore's desk, placing a small envelope in front of him. Whitmore picked it up, his eyes scanning the contents. His face immediately turned white. When he looked back at Marcus, There was pure terror in his eyes. Then he straightened. His voice was cold. "This meeting is over." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What's in that letter?" Whitmore said nothing, but Marcus didn't need an answer. Someone just gave Whitmore an order. Someone above him. And Marcus needed to find out who before it was too late. 11 a.m. FBI headquarters. The conference room was thick with tension. Linda sat in front of a large screen, displaying a web of financial transactions linked to Martin Langley. The money flowed from Westbridge to Hamilton and Company, then disappeared into a maze of Eastern European bank accounts. But something wasn't right. Linda frowned and zoomed in on a transaction. There, FBI Supervisory Agent Jonathan Harper looked up, his brows knitting together. "What do you see?" Linda pointed at a specific account number. "Langley's operation has a flaw. He cycles money through the same shell accounts. But his most recent transfer..." She hit enter. The screen refreshed, revealing a New York-based bank. 3 days ago, Langley wired a massive sum into a domestic account. Marcus, standing behind her with arms crossed, narrowed his eyes. Why would he do that? He knows we can track U.S. transactions more easily than offshore ones. Linda nodded. Exactly. Unless he wants us to see it. Marcus blinked. Langley was taunting the FBI, daring them to act, which meant he had a plan. 11:30 a.m. surveillance operation. FBI agent Patrick Doyle was assigned to track Vincent Ortega, the recipient of Langley's latest transaction. Ortega, a financial consultant operating out of Manhattan. His company was nothing more than a front for money laundering. Doyle sat in an unmarked surveillance vehicle, watching Ortega through binoculars. Everything seemed normal until Ortega left his apartment, but he didn't drive his usual car. Instead, he stepped into a black sedan, one that didn't belong to him. Doyle's instincts flared. He grabbed his radio, his voice urgent. Ortega just got into an unidentified vehicle. I need plate confirmation. A pause. Then, that car has no legal registration. A cold chill ran down Doyle's spine. I think he's being taken. And just as Doyle reached for his radio to report, boom, his car exploded. 11:35 a.m. FBI headquarters. Linda froze as the report came in. Doyle was attacked? Harper's jaw clenched. His eyes darkened. His vehicle exploded 10 minutes after he reported on Ortega. Marcus slammed his fist onto the table. Langley is making his move. Linda swallowed hard. Or he already knows we're watching. Marcus slowly looked up. The FBI had a mole. 12 p.m., Marcus's trap. Marcus knew someone inside the FBI was leaking information, and the only way to expose them was to set a trap. He stormed into the operations room, where Linda was working with the surveillance team. Linda, we need to spread false intel. She glanced up. What kind of intel? Marcus smirked darkly. That we have enough evidence to arrest Langley. Linda's eyes widened, but then she nodded in understanding. If there was a mole, they would alert Langley immediately. And when Langley reacted, they'd have their traitor. 12:30 p.m., the bait is set. Marcus monitored every outgoing communication from the FBI's internal network. They had planted the information that Langley's arrest was imminent. Now they just had to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Linda bit her lip. No movement. Even Marcus started to doubt. Then, a heavily encrypted email was sent out. Marcus immediately traced it. A name popped up. Agent Ryan Keller. 12:45 p.m., the mole is exposed. Marcus and Linda rushed to Ryan Keller's office. Inside, Keller was closing his laptop, ready to leave. Marcus slammed the door shut, Glock raised. Don't move. Keller froze, eyes wide. Linda pulled out handcuffs, her voice like steel. Ryan Keller, you are under arrest for espionage and leaking classified information. Keller took a slow breath, then smirked. You think arresting me will change anything? Marcus stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. No, but it will send a message to Langley. He's out of time. Keller let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? Linda narrowed her eyes. What are you talking about? Keller leaned forward slightly, his next words sending a chill down Marcus's spine. Langley is just a pawn. Marcus felt his blood pressure spike. Another pawn? Then who the hell was really in control? 1 p.m. FBI interrogation room. Ryan Keller sat calmly, his hands cuffed to the table. But he wasn't afraid. In fact, he was smiling. Marcus Bennett leaned forward, both hands pressed against the table, his stare sharp as a blade. Linda Martinez stood in the corner, arms crossed, her expression like cold steel. No one spoke. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of the wall clock. Finally, Keller broke the silence. He shrugged, his voice dripping with amusement. Appreciate the private room. Not bad service. Marcus didn't blink. He pulled out a chair and sat down, eyes locked onto Keller. You said Langley is just a pawn? Keller's smile widened. That's right. Linda stepped forward, her voice low and firm. Then who's really in charge? Keller tilted his head, pretending to think. Then he uttered a sentence that made both Marcus and Linda freeze. You don't have the clearance to know that. 1:30 p.m. FBI strategy room. Outside the interrogation room, Supervisory Agent Jonathan Harper slammed a file onto the table. We can't let him laugh at us like this. Marcus, however, remained calm. He's testing us. He wants to see how much we already know. Linda took a deep breath, tapping her fingers on the evidence board. We traced Langley. We caught the mole, but we still don't know who's actually running the show. We're missing a piece. Harper frowned. What about Whitmore? Can we use him? Marcus shook his head. No. Whitmore was already warned. Linda pressed her lips together. We need someone high enough in Langley's network, but also vulnerable enough to flip. Suddenly, a thought struck Marcus. He looked at Linda. What about Vincent Ortega? Linda's eyes widened. She quickly pulled up his file. Ortega, Langley's financial advisor. But he had disappeared right after Doyle was killed. She scanned his recent activity, then froze. He has a private jet. It just took off from a small airstrip in New Jersey. Marcus leaned in. Destination? Linda clenched her jaw. The Cayman Islands. Marcus turned to Harper. If he's running, that means Langley can't protect him anymore. Harper nodded and grabbed his phone. I'll call Homeland Security. We're stopping that plane. 2 p.m. Private airstrip, New Jersey. Vincent Ortega's private jet was already on the tarmac, engines roaring. But it never took off. A convoy of FBI vehicles swarmed the airstrip, red and blue lights flashing. Marcus and Linda jumped out of their SUV, guns ready. The jet's door opened. A middle-aged man stepped out, hands raised. Vincent Ortega. Marcus stepped forward, his voice unwavering. Vincent Ortega, you're under arrest for money laundering and aiding a criminal organization. Ortega took a deep breath, his eyes filled with fear. He knew there was no escape. 2:30 p.m. FBI interrogation room. Ortega sat in the chair, hands cuffed. Unlike Keller, he wasn't cocky. He was terrified. Marcus sat down across from him, his voice cutting straight to the point. Let's make this simple. If you don't tell us who's really behind Langley, you'll take the fall for everything. Ortega swallowed hard. I can't. If I talk, I'm dead. Linda folded her arms. If you don't talk, we can't protect you. Ortega wiped sweat from his forehead. He hesitated. Then he looked straight at Marcus and whispered a name no one expected. 2:45 p.m., the truth comes out. Marcus stood completely still. Linda, too, was frozen in shock. Marcus narrowed his eyes. You're saying Whitmore isn't just a pawn? He's the real mastermind? Ortega nodded. Langley is just a financial front. He provides the infrastructure, moves the money. But the one controlling everything is Whitmore. Linda took a sharp breath. She turned to Marcus. That means he's been playing us since the beginning. Marcus's fist clenched. Whitmore had manipulated the entire legal system, making them believe he was just another corrupt judge. But in reality, he was the architect of the entire operation. And he had known all along that the FBI was closing in. Now they had enough evidence to take him down. Marcus looked at Linda, his voice deadly calm. Call SWAT. We're arresting Whitmore. 5 p.m. FBI tactical room. The tension in the room was suffocating. On the large screen, a detailed map of Harold Whitmore's estate was displayed. Every gate, exit route, and security position marked in red. Marcus Bennett stood before the SWAT team, his expression hardened. Beside him, Linda Martinez flipped through a security dossier on Whitmore's private guards. Whitmore has at least 6 armed bodyguards, all former special forces. If we don't act fast, he'll escape. Supervisory Agent Jonathan Harper gave a firm nod, his voice grave. He has money. He has connections. If we're even a second late, he could disappear from the U.S. within hours. Marcus took a deep breath, then signaled the SWAT team. Move out. This was at 6 p.m. Whitmore's estate. The SWAT team approached the estate under cover of darkness. Each operative moved with precision, gripping their weapons tight. Marcus and Linda took the lead, their eyes locked onto the target. Through thermal cameras, they could see guards patrolling the front yard. Marcus whispered into his radio earpiece. Hold for my signal. We breach before he can react. Harper's voice crackled over the comms. Go. Boom. The front doors blew open, and the SWAT team stormed in. Gunfire erupted. 6:05 p.m. inside the estate. Shouting. Gunfire. Shattering glass. Whitmore had expected this. He didn't run immediately. He fought back. 2 bodyguards unleashed automatic fire at the incoming FBI team. Bang! Marcus ducked behind a pillar, returning fire, dropping one of them. Linda rolled forward, took aim, and shot the second guard in the leg. But just as they were securing the area, heavy footsteps pounded from below. Marcus's eyes widened. Shit, he's going underground. 6:10 p.m., the secret tunnel. Whitmore wasn't stupid. He knew this day would come, and he had prepared. Beneath his estate lay a hidden tunnel, leading to a warehouse half a mile away. While the FBI attacked from the front, he slipped out through the back. He ran through the dimly lit corridor, sweat dripping down his face. At the tunnel exit, his getaway car was waiting. But just as he stepped toward freedom, a voice echoed from the darkness. Into the road, Whitmore. Marcus Bennett stood at the exit, gun raised. 6:15 p.m., the standoff. Whitmore froze. His eyes darted, scanning for an escape. Marcus kept his Glock steady. Drop the weapon. There's nowhere left to go. Whitmore gave a dry chuckle. You really think you can stop me, Bennett? Marcus didn't blink. He took a step forward, his aim unwavering. Whitmore sighed dramatically, then raised his hands. Marcus stayed alert, his eyes tracking every movement. Slowly. Drop your weapon. Whitmore smirked. You don't get it, do you? I don't need a weapon. Then, he lunged for a switch on the wall. The tunnel lights cut out. Total darkness. 6:16 p.m., chase in the dark. Marcus rolled sideways, narrowly dodging a blindside attack. Whitmore wasn't surrendering. He was running. Marcus could hear his footsteps. Fast. Desperate. Whitmore bolted through the tunnel, gasping for breath. He knew that if he reached the exit, he could still escape. But Marcus was faster. He lunged forward, grabbing Whitmore's shoulder. Wham! Whitmore slammed onto the concrete floor. Before he could react, Marcus wrenched his arm behind his back. Game over. Whitmore struggled, panting. You can't arrest me. I have lawyers. I have... Click. Marcus locked the handcuffs around his wrists. You have the right to remain silent. Whitmore let out a furious snarl. He knew. It was over. 6:30 p.m., Whitmore's estate. Linda's radio earpiece buzzed. Agent Bennett has Whitmore in custody. Target secured. She exhaled deeply, a small smirk appearing on her lips. The SWAT team cheered in the background. FBI had won. Linda looked up at the setting sun, whispering, We did it. But deep inside, she knew. Justice never stops at just one case. 7 p.m., FBI holding cell. Inside the cold, dimly lit holding room, Harold Whitmore sat motionless on a metal chair, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't beg for a deal. He didn't panic. He simply sat there, silent, like a cornered wolf, waiting. Behind the one-way mirror, Marcus Bennett and Linda Martinez watched him. Linda folded her arms, her voice low. He's not like the others. Marcus narrowed his eyes, nodding. No, he knows this isn't over. Just then, Supervisory Agent Jonathan Harper entered the room, holding a thick case file. We have enough to put him away. But Harper paused, glancing at Marcus. I don't think he's going down without a fight. Marcus exhaled slowly, then turned to Linda. Time to have a chat. 7:10 p.m. FBI interrogation room. The door swung open. Marcus and Linda walked in, pulling out chairs to sit across from Whitmore. Whitmore looked up, a smug smile forming on his lips. Agent Bennett, Counselor Martinez, come to celebrate your victory? Marcus said nothing. Instead, he placed a thick folder on the table and flipped it open. Photos of Westbridge, Langley, secret bank accounts, and international money transfers. Linda tilted her head slightly, her voice razor sharp. We have enough evidence to bury you under multiple federal charges. Marcus sat back, his eyes locked onto Whitmore's. You're looking at 30 years minimum? Whitmore chuckled. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Do you really think I'll rot in prison that easily? Linda didn't blink. We don't think. We know. Whitmore sighed, shaking his head. That's a shame. I was hoping we could make a deal. Marcus raised an eyebrow. A deal? Whitmore smirked. Slowly, he placed both hands on the table, tapping his fingers against the cold metal. I have information. Information that the FBI would kill for. Linda's expression didn't change. What kind of information? Whitmore's smile grew. His eyes gleamed with confidence. The real power players. Not just in the U.S., but worldwide. Marcus and Linda exchanged a glance. Whitmore lowered his voice. If I go to trial, I'll talk. But I won't be rotting in a federal prison. I want an agreement. Marcus leaned forward, folding his hands together. Then, he said one word. No. Whitmore's smile vanished. Excuse me? Marcus smirked. You actually think the FBI will cut you a deal? Whitmore leaned back, narrowing his eyes. I don't think. I know. Linda shook her head. You don't have leverage, Whitmore. Marcus's voice dropped to a cold whisper. You've lost everything. For the first time, Whitmore's jaw tightened. Marcus was right, but Whitmore always had a backup plan. 7:20 p.m., a desperate escape. Suddenly, Whitmore lunged forward. He slammed his hands onto the table, knocking the files to the floor. Marcus and Linda immediately drew their guns. Sit down, Marcus shouted. But Whitmore wasn't done. In one swift motion, he pulled a hidden blade from his sleeve, slashing toward Marcus. Swish! The knife grazed Marcus's arm, leaving a shallow cut. Bang! Linda fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Drop the weapon. Breathing heavily, Whitmore's eyes burned with desperation. He bolted toward the door, but the second he yanked it open, boom! Marcus tackled him, slamming him into the ground. Whitmore roared, struggling, but Marcus didn't give him another chance. He wrenched Whitmore's arm back, locking the cuffs around his wrists. Game over. Whitmore panted, his face red with rage. He knew. It was over. 7:30 p.m., the final move. Linda stood, adjusting her blazer. She looked down at Whitmore, no longer furious, just resigned. Marcus took a deep breath, pulling Whitmore to his feet. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Whitmore let out a shaky laugh. You really think this is over? Marcus stared into his eyes. This was never over. Then he pushed Whitmore forward, out of the room, toward his fate. 9 a.m., Federal Court, New York. The media swarmed outside the courthouse. Protesters and supporters held up signs, their voices echoing through the streets. Justice for Danielle Roberts. Whitmore must pay. No one is above the law. FBI agents and uniformed officers guarded the main entrance, controlling the crowd. Inside the grand marble halls, the trial of Harold Whitmore was about to begin. 9:30 a.m., the trial begins. The double doors swung open. Harold Whitmore was escorted inside, his wrists shackled. Gone was the arrogance. Gone were the expensive suits. Gone was the power he once wielded. All that remained was a man facing a reckoning. Marcus Bennett sat in the back row, his gaze locked onto Whitmore. Beside him, Linda Martinez flipped through the case files one last time. The judge struck the gavel. This court is now in session. The United States versus Harold Whitmore, on charges including money laundering, corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to cover up criminal activities within Westbridge Financial. Whitmore lifted his head, his expression empty. His defense attorney rose, but had little to offer except, "The defendant pleads not guilty." Marcus smirked slightly. Of course he would, but there was no escape. 10 a.m., the evidence is laid out. The federal prosecutor presented a devastating case. White heavy checkmark financial records tracing illegal transactions from Westbridge to Hamilton and Company. White heavy checkmark testimonies from Paul Singleton, Vincent Ortega, and other insiders. White heavy checkmark photographic evidence placing Whitmore in secret meetings with Langley. White heavy checkmark audio recordings of Whitmore discussing the elimination of witnesses. Marcus watched Whitmore closely. At first, he kept his composure, but slowly, sweat began to bead on his forehead. He knew. The walls were closing in. 12 p.m., the verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. Then, the judge returned. The courtroom fell silent. The judge looked at Whitmore and delivered the final blow. "Harold Whitmore, you are found guilty of money laundering, corruption, and obstruction of justice. This court sentences you to 45 years in federal prison. No parole." The room erupted. Applause. Cheers. Justice. Marcus inhaled deeply and slowly exhaled. Linda turned to him, a small smile forming. "We did it." Marcus didn't respond. He simply watched as Whitmore was led away in chains. For the first time, Whitmore had nothing left to say. 2 p.m., Westbridge collapses. Breaking news. Chart decreasing Westbridge Financial declared bankruptcy. Link Martin Langley was arrested, charged with money laundering and conspiracy. The entire board of directors resigned in disgrace. Moneybag Westbridge agreed to compensate employees affected by workplace discrimination, including Danielle Roberts. Outside the courthouse, Danielle stood, tears in her eyes. She turned to Marcus, her voice shaking. "I never thought justice would come for me." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding. "You fought for it, and you won." Danielle smiled, tears rolling down her cheeks. 7 p.m., a quiet cafe near FBI headquarters. Marcus and Linda sat across from each other, steam rising from their coffee cups. Linda took a sip, then spoke softly. "So it's over?" Marcus smirked slightly. "No, it's not." Linda raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced out the window at the glowing city skyline. Whitmore and Langley weren't the only ones. There will be others. He exhaled. Justice never truly ends. Linda studied him for a second. Then she smiled. "Then let's keep going." Marcus nodded. He leaned back in his chair, took a sip of coffee, and let the city hum around him. For today, justice had won. Justice has prevailed this time. But how many hidden forces are still lurking in the shadows? If you want to uncover more dark conspiracies, don't forget to follow the channel and leave your thoughts in the comments.